I suppose I'll give you a little bit of a backstory to my own interest in this topic. And that, I suppose, it dates back to, I mean, my background really in academia is in entrepreneurship. So I've always been researching entrepreneurship. I've been delivering entrepreneurship programs and MBA programs. I've run the business growth program at Cranfield. So we engage with businesses with a turnover between 2 and 25 million and help them scale their businesses. Did that for many years. So I've always enjoyed that dimension of high-performing entrepreneurship. And then I think it was roughly about 2009, I got approached by the construction industry in the UK, and they said, "You're a researcher on self-employment." I said, "Well, not really self-employment, I'm a researcher on entrepreneurship." And they said, "Well, we're getting into awful trouble in the media and policy with regard to the use of self-employed workers on our construction sites." They said, "Would you be willing to do a report on this?" They said, "Because we think that people are missing the whole reason why we're doing it, and they're focused on tax evasion, and they're focused on false self-employment, and they're telling all these terrible stories about workers being exploited, et cetera, et cetera." And my first reaction was, I don't want to get messed up in this. I thought, my reputation isn't too bad at the moment. The last thing I want to do now is start getting involved in a piece of research going to drag me into a mudslinging fight. But nonetheless, I was interested to take a look at construction, because I suppose entrepreneurship research had been focusing on the same issues for about 15 years, and including some of my own research, we always label self-employed with no workers as the lowest performing form of entrepreneurship. So the entrepreneurship typically measured in terms of creating jobs and so on. So I was interested in taking a look at this. And when I started off by actually going on to a construction site and taking a look at what was happening. And when I saw the foreman's plan for the project and looked at the workforce model that was involved in that, the first thing that struck me on that plan was how specialized the labor was. So the people doing the groundworks just do the groundworks. Electricians obviously just do the electrics. Plumbers do the plumbing, the roofers do the roofing, the scaffolding just do the scaffolding, and so on. And when you look at the labor, the specialized labor used for all those projects, what hits you in the face from the Gantt chart is that they're all only used for an absolute fraction of the project. So if the project is running for 120 days, you find that most of these specialized workers are probably only being hired for anything to 20 to 60 and up to around about 80 days. So the reason they need to be self-employed, or the reason they need to be subcontracted out a lot of the time, is that the overhead cost of hiring them as employees would be enormous, because you'd have to have many more projects. And in fact, when I asked that, a number of the sites I visited, they said, "It's easy to know you're an academic." They said, "Well," this was Taylor Wimpey, they said, "We're currently in Worcester." They said, "Do you know where our other project is?" And I said, "No." They said, "Well, we've got one in Manchester and another down in Cornwall." They said, "How do you think we're going to get our electricians, if they were our electricians, up across all these?" So it became really apparent to me that to enable specialization and the productivity gains associated with that, that you needed to have this subcontracting model. And furthermore, the more I got into it, I realized that they were able to manage the risk in projects much more than having an employee model, simply because they could stop and start a project. So in other words, the old model in the construction industry used to be that they'd buy a site, and if the plan was to build 3 apartment blocks, they'd start the first one and they'd keep going until they finished the last one, because that was the most productive way to do it. But with this new model, they can buy the site and they can actually start by trying to sell as much property as they can off plan. Once they sell 20%, they start construction on the first block. And as they get towards the end of the first block, they only move on to the second block if they've already sold 20% off plan. So if there's an unexpected decline in the economy or a slump, they can basically mothball the site until things recover. So it took a huge amount of the risk out of the project for them. So it became quite apparent. So anyway, I got invited down to Westminster, and I presented this research in Westminster. And I made the case that while there may be other stuff going on in the construction industry, there also was a significant productivity boost and a significant amount more entrepreneurship in the industry, and indeed lower cost construction taking place because of the enabling of the freelance model. And one of the working groups of MPs down there basically got really interested in this, and they said to me, if this is happening in the construction industry, surely this model must be used elsewhere in the economy. And I said, at that point, of course, I was onto it myself, and I said, yeah, I think it is. And so long story short, they asked me to do a report on the UK economy generally. And the association IPSE, the Association for Independent Professionals and Self-Employed, sponsored that project. So I then went out and I did a project doing 23 case studies of large and small companies. And I asked them whether they used freelance workers or not. And if they did use freelance workers, I actually asked them why they were using them and for what activities and so on. So I'm going to talk through some of that. But to cut a long story short, on the back of that report, I then ended up getting involved quite a bit with policy groups in the UK and so on. But in short, what I found from that research was really that freelancers were enabling innovation, growth, and a great deal of entrepreneurship in both large and small companies. And of course, all of this is happening at the time that there is the equal problems of gig economy workers, particularly low-skilled workers who are on very low income in very precarious situations. There's situations where companies are evading employer payroll tax and so on. So it became a really big debate. I ended up then speaking at the Labour Party conference in Blackpool and the Conservative Party conference a year later. And I'll move on to that. But that's a bit of the... So I'm kind of tell that backstory to sort of place some of the research I'm going to present here, but also to place some of the narrative is that the UK in particular really sees the freelance workforce as a very complex workforce, but one that it has to get right. And from a public policy point of view, this is a workforce that they really want to harness in terms of driving the UK economy. So when I came back to Ireland, obviously I'm looking at this now from an Irish perspective, I see many of the same challenges here. So I'm going to talk mainly using UK data, but we'll relate back to Ireland. Okay, so I've rather been a bit brash in saying what governments and managers need to know, as if they don't know it already. But I think the key thing here is we have a debate, and I'll argue an unnecessary debate, because we're not differentiating between different types of freelancers and different types of self-employment. So I'm going to focus mainly in this presentation on high-skilled freelancers, and I'm going to talk about project-based as opposed to gig economy freelancers too. So I'll get on to that. But essentially, I think a lot of the problem we have in terms of accommodating and understanding this new type of work is the norms that we're used to. So I remember years ago giving an MBA class talking about the impact of digital distribution in music. This was in the late 1990s. And the class almost came to a standstill because I had too many students in the class who wouldn't give up the idea. They said, this is never going to happen. People will always want to buy albums and CDs, and what you're talking about is Star Trek stuff. It's not going to... and the thing is, we kind of just get latched on to what we're used to. So all of us in this room have grown up in an era where employment is the norm. But when we look at labour history, it's easy to forget that really employment only became the norm from really about the end of the Second World War onwards. So most of the Industrial Revolution in agricultural economy, self-employment, certainly in the agricultural economy, was the norm. And if you look at the labour contracts in the Industrial Revolution, most of those would be akin to freelance contracts today. And the reason those freelance contracts gradually disappeared was because of the well-being of workers and the income of workers. And as companies became larger and larger, more monopolistic, the exploitation of workers became a bigger problem. The labour unions grow, as we knew, and gradually the contractual terms started to change gradually over time. And then, of course, the welfare state came in, competition law came in, and all those things together really start to shape what we now consider as a standard employment contract. And out of that era then, if you think of that journey, is that employment contracts solved a problem, came this understanding here, is that freelancers then are very much regarded as disenfranchised employees, and that freelancing should be discouraged as it erodes a workers' employment rights. So we grew up in an era where employment workers' rights was de facto the best outcome for everybody. Yeah. So that started to change. And here are two reports that I was involved in. One for the Fabian Society. So the Labour Party in the UK are very interested in this, and they're interested in it for two reasons. One is that they are concerned about the precarious workforce on the one side, but they've also realised that there's a huge part of the labour force. I mean, the freelance workforce has pretty much doubled in size since the 1990s, and they realise there's votes out there to be won, and as a Labour Party, they need to understand that. So the Conservatives, of course, are automatically in that zone anyway. But so although I'm not affiliated with any political party, I was quite happy to write an article for the Fabian Review on new forms of work, and indeed to write a report with Philip Ross to help guide policy on in the Labour Finance and Industry Group in the UK. So this point of view isn't just some sort of, it's right across the political spectrum. This not just. So the essence of the problem then, I believe, is this here: is that there is diversity in the freelancing workforce, and if people don't accept that, then you're going to adopt a one-size-fits-all view, and then you'll end up in a debate that has no resolution. Yeah. So the only solution here really is to understand that this is a segmented workforce, and that some parts are vulnerable and precarious, and some parts are actually very privileged. And what we've got to try and do is, from a policy point of view, is protect the precarious and enable the privileged. Because the privileged side, A, it's good work for those people, and B, it's adding huge amount of value to the economy. So these types of debates are bogus. The idea that, freelancers are low-earning shadow workforce that competes with employees. Yes, some of them clearly are. Or, counter-view a workforce which are higher earning and complementary to employees. So I want to throw those debates out of the way, because they only occur when we're mixing up different types of self-employment. Now, I'm going to predominantly talk, don't worry, so that's, okay, I'll get past that side. I'm going to predominantly talk about one type of self-employed, and I'm going to talk about the self-employed that I think has been ignored by media and ignored by policymakers. So I think the low-skilled gig economy workers have had plenty of attention, and people are well aware of the problems in that segment of the market. But they're so well aware of the problems of that segment of the market that legislation is often being considered that would actually not only help that group, but actually would eliminate the right of other people to actually work on a freelance basis, and indeed make it very difficult for companies to hire freelance workers, either legally or even if it was legal, without reputational damage, because it's seen to be such a negative thing. So one of the things I forgot to mention is along that journey in the UK is we set up a think tank in London, which I'm currently the chairperson of. I'm planning to stand down at the end of the year. That's not news, by the way. And we brought together all the researchers internationally who are focusing in this area. But as I mentioned earlier, the UK government has tapped into this group on a regular basis. And one of the things we decided to get out was the diversity in self-employment. So we produced this report, which is available online. You can download it. But I thought some of the statistics are important here, because they may contrast with what some of the assumptions in the room may be. I mean, if you look at this self-employed, and this is in the UK now, 84% of self-employed are solo self-employed. That's probably not too surprising. But roughly just over half of those are quite happy doing what they're doing, and are in secure jobs and or secure work and making good income. About 15%, mainly in the low-skilled area, have an unclear status. This is what we probably regard as the kind of the false self-employed, and about 21% are in insecure work. So, somebody says there's tax evasion in the freelance solo self-employed sector. Yeah, there is. There's precarious work in that sector. Yes, there is. There's really privileged workers earning lots of money. Yes, there is. So the key thing is the segmentation. So. Okay, so to be clear then, just before I move on here on the difference between the freelancer and the employee, Now, I'm not going to talk about short-term employee contracts. That, in my view, is not self-employment. That's, yep, thank you. But if we compare the freelancer to the employee, the freelancer term of contract is typically project-based or limited duration as opposed to continuously employee. If the project doesn't go according to plan, if the work isn't happening, if there's a productivity problem in the project, that's usually borne by the worker in the case of a freelance contract. If you're an employee, that's typically borne by the firm. If you can't find work between the project, you take the risk as a freelance worker. In terms of a firm, that risk is borne by the firm. So the firm starts to run out of work. They then have to take the responsibility to try and find you more work in the. And the remuneration is usually output-based, or if it's input-based, it's based around the project. So X number of days, you define the project in days and do a day rate, as opposed to input-based on the employee side. So you say, why would somebody then bother to undertake this type of contract when this one over here has clearly more favourable terms? And the answer is money, and I think and the ability to have a flexible life. But when you look at the earnings. So one of the things we set up in the UK was the Freelance Confidence Index, which has been running now for 5 years, run on a quarterly basis. And one thing that comes out of that on a regular basis is the fact that the freelancers earn much more than the equivalent employees. Now, sorry, I've jumped ahead of myself. That survey is purely on the high-skilled freelancers, so it doesn't look at the low end. So it's looking at half of the self-employed workforce. Standard Occupational Code 1, the executives. Standard Occupational Code 2, professionals and technological workers, and Standard Occupational 3, which is technical workers. They're all high-skilled work. But the earnings are typically more than twice the earnings of equivalent employees. So that study I mentioned, these are a list of some of the companies, and I just want to talk about a few examples of this freelancing in operation. So I want to talk about Argos Direct. So I think everyone here, we all know Argos, take it, yeah? So Argos, if we go back about 10 years ago, Argos had obviously a very highly successful high street operation. Internally, they came up with the idea that maybe they should actually move some of the business online and set up Argos Direct. The company's senior executives took a decision. They said, you know what, the last thing we want are all our workforce. We're making plenty of money with the cash cow. The last thing we want to do is distract all of these workers onto some sort of innovation project. And furthermore, what happens if this thing doesn't work? So what they did was they set up a separate unit, Argos Direct, and they staffed it with a freelance team. And that team both designed a website, put together all the back-end logistics, launched Argos Direct, and actually grew Argos Direct to a turnover of 100 million just after 2 years. And at that point, Argos Direct realized that it had a success story on its hands. And then it integrated Argos Direct back into the parent company. The freelance workforce was phased out and was replaced by employees. So what you've got there is freelancers used in the risky part, freelancers used in the part that needs innovation and expertise that's sometimes outside the skill of the company, and freelancers driving growth and employment in the company. So for the first time, we got something that's rather new in economic history, is that we don't have the freelancer and the worker competing for the same work. We actually, for the first time, have the workers, the employees, relying on freelancers to actually create their jobs in the first place. And what we've just seen is that the freelancers who are doing this work are paid a significant premium on the wages earned by employees in the process. And this is where the UK public policy are interested from an economic point of view. And I feel this is the important message that's kind of getting lost. Another example of this is Arm Holdings in the UK that was set up when competing with Intel. I mean, utter madness, you'd think. Intel, huge international giant, hugely cash rich. But Arm Holdings took them on and they said, well, we won't get into manufacturing, we'll take them on in intellectual property rights, licensing the technology in the chips. And the way they did it was using freelancers. They put together a freelance team that was skilled to deal with the particular chip they were making and grew on that model. And they used that model also on their sales side as well. And of course, last year we know that SoftBank bought Arm Holdings for 23 million. And another example, this one company you probably don't know, is PTS Consulting. They're not a big company at all. It's one on the smaller side. But they provide all the wiring infrastructure. So a building, like if it's a building like this being built, they would put all the wiring inside that would connect lights and so on. And one of the things that they had with their early stage of their business was they prided themselves on having an employee-only model. So when they were pitching for work, they said you can be guaranteed that this work will be done by PTS employees. But they found it very hard to grow their company because anytime they got a big contract, they were terrified of hiring loads of employees and then not being able to find another project afterwards. So eventually they switched it to a mixed model, indeed like the other companies using mixed model, where a proportion of the workforce would be freelancers. And in the process, they could use the freelancers to, so if there's a big jump in demand here, they could use the freelance workforce to suffice that demand. And if their level of business jumps up permanently to here, then they can move to a new model where their employee base moves up to here and the freelance base picks up the slack. And that's really the sort of model that all of the other companies were using, but for very different reasons. Argos Direct in the case of innovation and so on. So that led to a study where we then said, okay, we've got all this case study evidence pointing to this. What is the statistical evidence? So we did some statistical analysis. And what we found basically was that if companies use a mixed model, or the companies using mixed models were tending to grow faster in terms of employment growth. So we're able to find a positive relationship between the use of freelancers and employment growth. Now, there's obviously an overall jobs increase, but so you find very little effect when there's only about 1.5% of the workforce, very little effect to 7.4. But once you move up to about 17%, nobody seems to, not many firms would go over the 51%. You see a big jump up in the job growth. So basically, we then have a freelance workforce model where companies are having a mixed workforce, employees and freelancers, to generate a range of benefits: expertise beyond the confines of employees, variable cost workforce, agile, flexible workforce, a lean model, enabling risk management. And that all combined tends to make markets more competitive. So these then are the projects that are typically used: corporate ventures, new business startups, R&D and innovation, adoption of new technology, scaling freelance project bases, and the project-based organizational structure itself. So finally then, we wanted to take a look then at the freelancers themselves and said, okay, so we seem to have two types of work here. We've got the gig work, which is kind of selling on a task basis, but what we've been looking at all the way through so far is what we'd really consider something different. It's really project-based work. With all this attention on the gig economy and the gig work, I thought it might make sense to actually try and break the ice and get a proper debate going if we can distinguish another side. So we did a survey where we asked freelancers whether this statement made any sense to them or not. So we said they either agree with it or disagree. If they agree with it, they are a project-based worker. If they disagree with it, they're a gig worker. And if they don't know, then they don't make any sense of the project. And so this is a survey then based on users of people per hour in the UK and IPSE. And what you see here is that in terms of the workforce of these skilled freelancers in the UK, the project-based economy is in the workforce about 5 times larger than the gig economy. If you look at the income, what's interesting at this skilled level is that typically the project-based workers earn more, but it's not uniform. In other words, gig workers in the high-skilled sector do particularly well as well. And what was interesting about this finding here was that even the gig workers on the high-skilled end do better than equivalent employees. And in terms of the value to the economy then, with all the talk about gig work and how important it is for the economy or what share of the economy, really, if you look at the UK figures, the gig economy is 5 times, sorry, the project-based economy is 5 times more important than the gig economy. So this really leads us then back to the policy and law, is that if we take this, then we say we've looked at one segment, we've looked at high-skilled freelancers in a project-based economy. And what we've seen there is that they're a major driver of growth, innovation, and entrepreneurship, and indeed job creation. So something from an economic prosperity and growth point of view, something we'd want to encourage. We've also seen the size of it is much bigger. And we've also seen from the worker point of view, through a number of studies, that in this sector, the workers are doing particularly well, earning more than employees. So the issue, therefore, is that with all the publicity around the negative gig economy and precariat workers, is we need really for government policy to distinguish the project-based and the high-skilled out from the rest, because it isn't a sector that necessarily requires support in terms of protection of employees in terms of rights, because they wouldn't be hired in the first place if they weren't on the contract that I started out with. So there's a need for government to distinguish, recognise and to nurture this segment, and ultimately that implies a need for the law to catch up with this new form of work. And I suppose that's where we're going to get to with the discussion, and also this is the point I hand over to Katie. Okay, thank you.